jump back into David and Goliath. So Saul tries to give him his armor around 38, something like that, right? 39, David strapped Saul's sword over the armor. Couldn't walk around. Says, can't do this. But he has a plan all along for how he's going to take out the giant. So I want to read verse 40. 1740.
Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine.
Okay, so what's he carrying? And why? Why the staff? Just in case he has to poke him?
He's a shepherd boy.
He's a shepherd boy.
And his shepherd staff.
Gets smooth stones, 5 stones. Just in case he missed with the first few. And then it says his sling was in his hand. So his staff's in his hand. Is that in one hand? And his sling's in the other hand? So some commentators think the stick is a distraction, pretty much. Got the big stick here. Not going to notice my little sling in the other hand. That's nice. The sling is like a long piece of rope, leather, can kind of bundle up and bunch up, not like a big slingshot or something. But so it's kind of covertly being held, snuck onto the battlefield. He's got a big stick. He described what he was going to do as hand-to-hand combat, but that's not what he has in mind at all. Baruch Halpern, who wrote a book on David, talks about how in the ancient world you basically had 3 types of divisions. So you have in warfare, cavalry, they're on horses. You have infantry and artillery. Artillery can be bows or slings. Okay? He kind of describes it as kind of a big game of rock, paper, scissors. Does anyone know what rock, paper, scissors is?
Oh look, Saturn 3 is on.
I don't want to watch Saturn 3. Deep Space Nine is better.
How is Deep Space Nine better than Saturn 3?
Simple subtraction will tell you it's 6 better. Compromise. Watch Babylon 5.
In what sense is that a compromise?
Well, 5 is part way between 3. Never mind. I'll tell you what. How about we go rock, paper, scissors?
Well, I don't think so. No. Anecdotal evidence suggests that in a game of rock, paper, scissors, players familiar with each other will tie 75 to 80% of the time due to the limited number of outcomes. I suggest rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock.
What?
It's very simple. Look, scissors cuts paper, paper covers rock. Rock crushes lizard, lizard poisons Spock. Spock smashes scissors, scissors decapitates lizard, lizard eats paper, paper disproves Spock, Spock vaporizes rock, and as it always has, rock crushes scissors.
So you go 1, 2, 3, rock, paper covers rock. 1, 2, 3, scissors cuts paper. 1, 2, 3. Oh, but rock beats scissors, right? So all 3 beat something else. He says it was kind of like that in the ancient world, according to Baruch Halpern. I think it's called David's Secret Demons is the book he describes it. So if infantry was fighting cavalry, cavalry doesn't beat the infantry because they got pikes. As you ride up towards them, you can take out the horses, stuff like that. Artillery against cavalry. The cavalry is fast and can cut the distance between the archer quickly. So generally, they would use the cavalry to take out the line of people ready to sling or shoot arrows. But infantry against artillery, artillery always wins against infantry. So if it was just a guy and you got a sling or an arrow, generally the artillery should win. So in this instance, then, David, using artillery, a slingshot, actually has a big advantage over a single soldier. And unless we think it's just like a kid's toy, it was a powerful weapon of war, and they can be deadly accurate. In Judges 20, it talks about these people who could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. So that may be kind of a hyperbolic way to say, but they're that accurate. They're very, very accurate. And in the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides describes how the slingers decimated some troops as they came through a pass. Like they were used in real combat, in real war, and could kill people. So it was a deadly weapon. So he takes the staff in his hand. Is that a distraction? Because he's actually sneaking out onto what is soon to be one-on-one, hand-to-hand combat artillery out there. And what does that mean for David? Is this an unfair way to do it? Goliath seems to think he doesn't see the artillery. He says, "Oh, you come to a dog, you meet me with sticks?" Because he's got the big stick in his hand, right, as a distraction, something like that. So some have characterized David as actually being a very unfair fight here. When usually it's understood that it's unfair because Goliath's huge and David's this small little boy. But actually he has the advantage by sneaking out a slingshot into the battlefield. What do you think if this is a correct characterization of war? How would this reflect on David? Smart?
I find this as an open war, so anyone can use whatever that suits them.
All is fair in love and war?
Yeah.
Hmm?
So it's not like boxing or MMA. You have to just do boxing.
Right.
But it's an open war. Whatever fits you to win the war, do it.
Yeah. So some suggest that in representative combat like this, the understanding was it was going to be one-on-one combat where you fight with swords or spears or not artillery. And then they would think that was unfair of David, but it was war.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant plan. Get out there, distract him with the stick, and I'm going to take him out with my sling.
A lot of the wars, even with one-on-one, it's a lot of strategies.
Mm-hmm.
In this case,
Brilliant strategy.
It's a
Brilliant strategy. Look at verse 41.
Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield barrier in front of him, kept coming closer to David.
He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him.
Okay, so remember God said he didn't look as people looked, right? When then David is described, he's this ruddy, good-looking boy. Here Goliath similarly looks down on David and thinks, this guy is just nothing. You send me this little boy out. He doesn't see what God saw in David, right? The Philistine keeps walking. So someone had mentioned Malcolm Gladwell's interpretation. So you may have heard of Malcolm Gladwell, famous Canadian author, one of the best-selling authors in the world, I think. And he, in his book David and Goliath, he in one chapter he talks about David and Goliath. The rest of the book's not so much about that, but he talks about how David actually had the advantage. So he actually draws on Bruce Halpern's understanding of the methods of artillery versus infantry to say David has an advantage there. But not only that, he talks about how Goliath must have been suffering from giantism because he's so huge. And giantism usually is debilitating, and that you can't move fast and you're walking slow. And he says the armor bearer is carrying his armor, and it keeps saying he's walking. The Philistines coming closer and closer, but actually it may have looked like he had the advantage, but he didn't. And so he thinks things are not always as they appear, is kind of what he's going with that. And then a little later on, here, I'll come back to that. Just keep that in mind. Let's read a little bit more of the passage, and I'll come back to a little bit more of what they said.
Am I a dog? He roared at David that you come at me with a stick, and he cursed David by the names of his gods.
Come here, he said to David, and I'll feed your flesh to the wild birds and the wild animals.
David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied.
This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcass of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel.
All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands.
All right. There's some pretty good rhetoric. So when David was introduced, he is a mighty warrior who is also good at speech, and this is a pretty darn good speech. So he replies to the Philistine who trash talks him a little bit about giving his flesh to the birds of the air, and this is a pretty powerful retort. And it's a retort of faith as well. Now David, mind you, has a sling in his hand, so he has a reason to be hopeful he could take out this giant maybe, but as long as he's a good slinger. But he is very concerned about God's reputation too, right? It's interesting, the giant curses by the names of his gods, and then he comes out and says, well, I'm coming to you, the God who's in charge of the hosts of heaven, the Yahweh of the hosts. The hosts of heaven were usually what the gods were of other nations, like the sun, the moon, and various stars, constellations, and this type of thing. And the Lord of hosts really means, I think some translations say, the Lord of armies. It's the hosts of heaven, or sometimes referred to with false gods too. This is the true God, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you defied. So he has confidence. It's not by sword that the Lord saves, the battle is the Lord. We're about to read that David took out the giant without the sword, which fulfills exactly what David's saying here, which is it's a pretty powerful moment. Someone commented on this that this is kind of a unique moment in the biblical literature, where it's almost like a superhero moment where this guy gets up and just gives this fantastic speech and amazingly delivers a powerful victory. Like, you haven't seen anything like this in the Bible yet so far. You got Moses, you got a lot of heroes in the past, but this is kind of almost a new level of this kind of hero in Israel. And then you read in 48, Philistine drew near to meet David. Again, this is what Gladwell is talking about, where it seems like the Philistines just forever slowly coming forward, and he thinks it's because of giantism. Now, he doesn't originate any of that. He quotes scholars who've suggested this type of thing before. What do you think of the idea that he's actually physically debilitated, even though he looks big? Do you think that was likely? It does seem he's moving slower. Of course, he's weighted down with all this armor. And then in response it says, David ran quickly to meet him, right? So David is unencumbered by armor. He can move quickly. The Philistines weighted down by, they mentioned how heavy all his armor was, and he even has a shield bearer with him. And he's moving slowly. So some trying to explain the height by giantism suggest that, well, people who suffer giantism often have physical disabilities. I think it unlikely, because why would they send out this guy as their champion if he really was physically disabled? You're putting a lot of your weight on this guy when really he just looks tough, but everybody knows he can't do much. I think it is interesting, this combination of David actually sneaks a kind of a gun onto the battlefield.
To a knife fight?
Yeah, right? That's the same kind of thing. So infantry versus artillery, the infantry die. And it reminds me of Indiana Jones. Not quite like that. Always a funny moment. So how did David pull it off? Well, first of all, of course, he finds out what the reward was, confirms it numerous times. Some say he duped Saul into letting him fight by describing hand-to-hand combat when he's not really going to do that, or maybe making up the battle with the animals. I'm not sure we have reason to doubt that those happened. And then sneaks a revolver onto the battlefield. But it was war, like you said. So I'm not sure how badly that should reflect on David. It actually is kind of a genius way to approach it. And it's not like they all surrendered because their champion was dead, right? It's not like in this representative combat, it really does okay, we're all your servants. We're done. No, then war breaks out, right? There's lots of fighting. So it's a little different than that. It's interesting, you've seen Michelangelo's David. Supposedly, and I guess when you look at it, his head is a little large. And Michelangelo made his head larger because he succeeded not through his might or brawn, but his higher intelligence or something like that. I read that once in an art history thing I was taking. I can't remember the details, or I'd quote it for you. But that was how, the philosophical kind of Italian view of the hero was. But actually, when you look at it, it's not exactly his brawn that does it, right? 1 Samuel 16, this is where it was, where it said, God looks at humans in a different way. Goliath looked at him in the typical human way and despised him. He's a boy, ruddy and handsome. This is Eugene Peterson's translation of the message. He says, he looked down on him and sneered, a mere youngster, apple-cheeked and peach-fuzzed. I think it's funny. I mean, it's not a literal translation, but that's kind of, you get this feeling that he said, oh, this little brat, you send this guy out to get me, and whoa, he, of course, loses the battle. Let's read a little bit more of the chapter here. Actually, why don't we read the little battle?
As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him.
David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone. He slung it and hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone penetrated his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground.
So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him.
David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran.
Okay, so there's a little controversy over whether the stone killed him or the sword killed him, because literally in Hebrew it says both. But I think your translation said after he killed him, he cut off his head. And that's just a way of trying to harmonize and figure out what it is. But so he hits him in the head, falls down, and then he grabs the sword and... What's that?
No.
Oh.
He didn't say he grabbed the sword and killed him. He's just after killing him.
No, but your translation says after killing him.
Yeah,
Other translations don't say after. They say they took the sword and killed him.
him.
Yeah. So it's, to me, it's not a big deal, but the way it's written is, it sounds like he killed him without a sword, and then, but he took the sword and killed him. I think the whole thing is, it's just the narrator and the tradition is amazed that he prevails over him with a sling and a stone, and there was no sword in his hand. And that's the main thing here, is that not so much whether he was unconscious and then he cut off his head. When was he dead? How would someone know? Like, especially in the ancient world, he knocks him out, he's down. Well, he killed him. Then he cuts off his head. Did that kill it? Yeah, dude, let's check his pulse. He's not dead. Boom. It was probably right away. Grab the sword, make sure he's dead, right? You know. So, but anyway, sometimes that's talked about a little bit. And they go pursue him. They plundered the camp. Look down on verse 54. So I want to read 54.
Yeah, David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent.
Okay. He brought it where?
This is weird.
This is kind of odd. Why is that odd?
Because he's not supposed to be there. Apparently he's just shown up, so why would he have a tent?
And how about Jerusalem? What's going on with Jerusalem?
No.
Jerusalem was not taken yet.
Jerusalem is still a Jebusite city right now, right? After he becomes king, he takes Jerusalem and makes it his capital. That's a long way in the future. So, different ways of understanding it. Some think it's anachronistic, that the source was written well after David became king, and they knew that the head of the Philistine was kept in Jerusalem, so they said that. Eventually, he did put it in Jerusalem, right? It doesn't mean not right now. Others suggest this may be hinting at David's ambition, too. He was friendly with the Jebusites. After all, they coexisted with them. They never have, until he takes Jerusalem, you don't have any problems with them. And so he actually, in future, thinking of that's where he wants to have his capital, takes the head there. That's how some commentators have understood it. But anyway. And he put his armor in his tent. I assume he had a tent to go to eventually that day. But you're right. I never even thought of that part before. Yeah, where's his tent? It's interesting, back at the beginning with Hannah's song or poem in chapter 2. If you remember the line, I can't remember if I talked about it the day we looked at this. Don't keep talking so proudly. Literally, if you look at the Hebrew, is don't increase your speaking, O tall one, O tall one. So there's this reference to how God is going to vindicate his anointed one, and his anointed will triumph. And it talks about the tall one. Talk no more very proudly. Don't let arrogance come out of your mouth. So some have suggested that this poem, this song, this prophetic utterance is to do with, of course, David, who triumphs over Goliath. Others suggest it may be Saul too, because Saul is tall, but there's this talk about triumphing over the tall one, which is very interesting. So despite all David's ambition that we've seen highlighted there, he has a very profound theological perspective, right? He seems to take it very seriously that these people are defying the armies of Israel. No one else there, Saul, the other Israelites, didn't seem to ever bring that part of it to the fore, that this is to the fore, that they're defying God, right? He had this very theological perspective of this pragmatic political crisis of war, but hey, how dare they? He had such a view of God that, hey, God is the Lord of hosts, the God of all the armies. How dare they defy us? So he had a very, very theological perspective and a passion for God. So when I've preached from this text before, I point out David's humanness, his ambition, but also the stuff we've been looking at, his complexity. He also has this strong passion and theological perspective on life and existence, and we can reflect on that in ourselves. And what David had a very spiritual perspective in one sense, but was also very pragmatic on the other hand. He takes a sling out to the field, right? He's cunning, he's got a brilliant plan, but at the same time, he's not so heavenly minded, he's no earthly good, as they sometimes say. But they're both caught in there. Let's jump down to, is it 55?
As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistines, he said to Abner, commander of the army, Abner, whose son is that young man? Abner replied, surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know.
Well, find out who he is, the king told him.
So when David came back from killing the Philistines, Abner sent for him and presented him to Saul. The Philistines' hand was still in David's hand.
Whose son are you, young man? Saul asked him. David said, I'm the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem.
Okay, so when did that conversation between Saul and Abner take place in 55?
Before he goes to Jerusalem with the head.
Yes, definitely. But what's it say in verse 55? It seems like it's kind of a flashback.